Okay, well, look, welcome everybody. Welcome members and guests. Just to let you know, we are recording tonight's session as usual. So the plan is that we'll put it onto YouTube for those folks that weren't able to make it. Just got more folks to let in. So that's good. Just a reminder, we are, I believe, still holding our Zoom sessions on Tuesday nights at 8 o'clock. So if you haven't been doing that, then you can join that. If you lost the Zoom link, just perhaps ping something in the chat window and I can let you know about that again. That's no problem at all. Yeah, it looks like lockdown is Monday in the UK here. Lockdown is finally starting to come to an end. So we'll be able to hopefully meet up again soon. And on that subject, some of you members will have received an email today from myself about doing another session at Epsom Downs on Monday night. So if you're in the UK, and you're not far away, feel free to join us at Epsom Downs 8 o'clock in the Long Car Park, and we'll meet up there. And as of Monday, there'll be no restrictions on numbers, and that should be fine. What else to talk about here? It's our 75th anniversary this year. I think I mentioned this on the previous meeting, and our plan is on the 1st of October 1946 that we had our very first meeting in the old Red Lion pub in Cheam, and the plan is that on the 1st of October this year, which is a Friday, the plan will be that we'll meet again at that same time to sort of celebrate that anniversary. So we're just thinking about exactly what we're going to do. We'll probably go along to that and do something and make it special. Have a look at the website. I've actually arranged some new talks coming up. We now got some talks right through until March now, so have a look on there. You'll see some new topics that might be of interest, but hopefully something there that might that'll be of interest to you. So anyway, we've got a great speaker for you tonight. We've got Frank Howell, a repeat speaker for us. Frank did a talk for us, I think it was last year, wasn't it, Frank? Yeah. So Frank's brave, decided to join us again. And tonight, Frank, you're talking about, well, you tell us in a second, but basically price, performance and satisfaction in HF rigs. And I guess you'll tell us all about it. So Frank, I'm going to pass it over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. Let me just say it's always an honor to be asked to speak to any group of people. And I don't think we hams acknowledge that maybe as much as we should, at least from my viewpoint. And it's a real special honor to be asked to come back. So I'm delighted to speak to you again this evening. And I do hang around with Chris and Martin with the ICQ podcast. So it's just been a real pleasure to get to know both of them. And since I guess early on, as Martin and I were talking before we went live, since at least 2013, although I took a hiatus for a few years. So it's just a real delight. What I'll talk about tonight is a study that I conducted, and it was published in the National Contesting Journal that the ARRL publishes in a two-part series. And it really gets at something that I think everyone who has high frequency privileges has to struggle with. What rig do I buy? How much does it cost? And what should I pay to get a good rig? And am I going to like it after I get it? So I certainly have been down that road to the point where when someone asks me, what HF rig should I get? I usually say, well, it mostly doesn't matter for your first one. And they look, well, that doesn't make sense. Now, well, I said, well, yeah, it matters some, but it doesn't matter in the long run. And they say, why? I said, because it will not be the only one you ever have. I think that's one commonality. We always move on, particularly over time, even if we keep that, elderly and venerable, whatever it might be. So as I puzzled over this, I thought, well, the best source of data, if we measure performance, is either published in the test reviews in something like the RSGB. Practical Wireless has been publishing for a long time. Radio User has, perhaps, I don't think it's quite as long as PW, but I might be wrong about that. The ARL's QST has had a lab and has published, but really Rob Sherwood an independent engineer in Colorado, his Sherwood tables, I would sort of call them the gold standard in the sense that he's been doing it for a while. He doesn't take advertising. He speaks his mind and so on. So I said, we have the Sherwood tables. I wonder if I could put together data on what they cost, and then how do I find out what people like them? Well, basically the only source there is EHAM that gives a consistent rating where you're not just subjectively trying to figure out what people are saying. So my talk is called, Does Price Buy Performance or Satisfaction in an HF Transceiver? Now, I'm a retired professor of sociology and statistics. So I've spent about 4.5 decades or so doing analyses like this, not on amateur radio, but on lots of things. And so I've literally done hundreds of studies of this type. And so I wanted to apply some of my skill set to this problem and see what we could come up with. So let's see if I can. All right. So I like to talk about some of the blokes from your side of the pond here, the Beatles. They had an important song, Money Can't Buy Me Love. The Stones had one that was popular, Can't Get No Satisfaction. And those are two things that we use to talk to one another. I just can't find something I like, and well, money's not going to do it for. And then someone counters with the ever popular statement, well, you get what you pay for. Well, I want to focus on those things because I think that's a logic that we all find ourselves using in our own decisions and also talking to each other about. Steve Ford, who's retired from the ARRL, and he used to be the editor of QST, wrote a little pamphlet a number of years ago, and I'm quoting this here. It says, you finally got some cash to spend on amateur radio equipment, but you want to make the right choice. Ask any veteran ham, and he or she will tell you about the blanky blank radio they publish. You hear people that curse out any number of vendors for that radio they just bought and they hate it. Well, nobody wants to throw away money, but how do you know which rig is best? Does this logic work in an HF transceiver? Now, the league would be sued and would go out of business if they recommended radio, so they don't do that. I don't think the RSGB does either, but they do publish bench tests. And so Rob Sherwood has done a table of bench tests for receiving, and I point that out. Now, recently, as of 2 or 3 years ago, he published a paper and said, we really got to test transmission as well. So in the future, perhaps we'll get a little more serious about that as well. EHAM has some crowdsourced, volunteered satisfaction ratings and some narratives, about it. And I spent quite a bit of time dealing with the price issue, and I'll get to that again. So we're left with some complicated options. I don't know across the pond, but here in the States, there was a cereal, morning coal cereal called Life. And back years and years ago, they had a famous commercial with this little toddler. And this, kind of like Martin and I are called the two toddlers on the ICQ podcast. They were actual toddlers in diapers. So he sat there and his name was Mikey. And so when mom bought the cereal, they didn't want to eat something new, so they said, let's see if Mikey likes it. And they pushed that bowl in front of him, and the camera caught Mikey eating it and liking it. And I say, hey, Mikey likes it. Well, we're not too different from that. When we know some other hams, hey, Chris Howard got a FT 101D, and boy, he loves it. Well, I think Chris is a smart guy, and I think I'm going to get one too. We find ourselves doing things like that. That's one way. Number two, we can look at some of these bench ratings where there have been more or less professional test figure measurements done by the ARL, RSGB, or Rob Sherwood, and see what's best on the bench. You will occasionally get people say, well, I don't agree with that. That's not my experience. I'm going to come back to what that means. You can read EHAM's product reviews, and people do that. I hear them on the air. I'm part of the volunteer monitoring program, so I'm listening on HF quite a bit, and I tune through the bands, and I hear people quote EHAM. So it is a force, whether you agree with it or not. Who likes it, who doesn't like it, and why? You have another option. Now, a couple of times I've given this talk, I've just taken my wallet out and taken whatever cash I had and just threw it up in the air for dramatic effect. You can say, okay, I'll just throw a bunch of money at it. Surely I'll get a great rig by doing that. Well, you might, and I'm going to show you how that can happen. We're also going to show you how it cannot happen. How much does price matter? And this can be somewhat like a dog chasing its tail, but it's not the sources of these data that are challenging in my view. It's putting them together in a coherent way to make sense of them. And that's what I'm trying to look at here tonight. I put together a unique data set from these three sources where I've looked up the price as it was introduced to the marketplace. I've got Rob Sherwood's measured performance of receiver capability, and I've got the 1 to 5 ratings in the EHAM data set for each rig in Rob Sherwood's tables. It's about 125 rigs. Now, on prices, I went back and looked at QST, many other magazines. I went back to CQ magazine. I've got historical archives. I looked in historical RSGB, the first year they were introduced, and I tried to get the price, what we used to call manufacturer suggested retail price. And that was kind of the price as presented to the marketplace. Not looking at used prices, not looking at rally discounts or things like that, but that price as it was introduced there. Now, the Sherwood tables, as I said, they're almost the holy grail for this kind of thing. So I'm using this data set to look at price, performance, and satisfaction for individual rigs, not everything Yaesu made or Kenwood or Raycal or whoever, but individual rigs. But I'm going to come back to who made it here in some of the analysis. Now, to my knowledge, this is the first time anybody has reported such a study with this, even though it's modest, this comprehensive character. So I've kind of told you about the rigs. I'm calling them rigs because, for example, some of them are just receivers. My beloved Perseus SDR from Italy, it's in there. There are some others that are receivers only, but I'm going to call them rigs, whether they're transceivers or receivers. So Rob's table covers rigs over a 50-year period. I don't think he was even completely aware of that till I shared some early results with him. So not every single rig manufactured over 5 decades is included in his tables, but I think very few important or popular rigs are not included. Now, there were a small number of rigs that were not reviewed on EHAM, and there was just nothing I could do about it. So they were omitted. A couple of the rigs had second measurements by Rob because there was some modification the manufacturer made. And so he did another measurement. Now, this is not, for example, an upgrade to the rig. Let's take the Kenwood TS590S, which is very popular. They then came out with the 590SG. Those are considered separate rigs in this study. I'm talking about a radio that had a minor tweak that Rob gave the manufacturer the courtesy of coming back and reviewing it again. I used his first review without the tweaks because that's what you likely got if you bought it new. And all that kind of keeps the measurements very consistent. Being a statistician, that's important to me. A final count of 126 rigs in my data set were used. So real quickly, price is what the manufacturer states is the suggested retail price of the observed price in the year of release to the marketplace. It doesn't track discounts or used prices. It's the product value, as economists call it, placed on it by the manufacturer. And this is a signal to the marketplace on the product. It's consistent from rig to rig. And the only way that that you can do that. My wife is a consumer economist. Her PhD is in that subject matter. And so that's the only way you can get your arms around that. So you're not favoring one or the other, because you're going to favor the newer rigs. Now, I want you to think for a moment. When you've heard a manufacturer say they're going to come out with a new radio, let's just take the ICOM IC 9700. There are any satellite fans out there? You know, that's a very popular rig for Earth, Moon, Earth bounce, for satellite work. They've got satellite mode, whatever. Well, what was everybody saying before it actually came out? How much is it going to cost? What are they going to ask for it? So if you think about our behavior collectively, we look at that as a signal. When the IC 705 came out, when Elecraft comes out with the K4, how much is it going to cost? So that's what I'm really getting at. Now, most of that came from QST, some, as I said, CQ, Ham Radio Magazine, Monitoring Times, and some others. This took the greatest amount of time for me to track down. On some of the Collins radios, I actually searched online in archives and got the original Collins catalog, which listed the actual manufacturer suggested price. I spent the greatest amount of time getting the price data. Now, because this is over a 50-year period, you know, a dollar back 50 years ago buys a lot more as a dollar would today because of inflation. So I transformed all those into 2019 US dollar values using our Bureau of Labor Statistics Consumer Price Index. This is a very common procedure. Let me apologize to you for not having it in British pounds. If one would wish to do that, it would be important to have the exchange rate at the year the rig was introduced. Now, as I'll talk in a bit, I'm probably going to update this, and I'm probably going to add some more variables to it. And if I do, I'll probably go back in and do US dollars, British pounds. So, you know, give me a year, can't get a good speaker, want to know what some updates, you know, I may have that in the money that you deal with every day. All right, so let's look at some of the results. This little thing on the right side of the screen is a histogram of the prices over these 126 rigs in US dollars. What do you see? Most of them cluster around $3,000 or about $3,200. The median being 3,177. But wow, some of them can be very expensive. And remember, we talked about just throw money at it. Keep that in mind. Now, that blue curve is what a normal curve would look like. So, you know, just over $3,000 is the median over all these rigs when you keep inflation. Well, I wonder how well those that are really expensive perform. And I wonder if people like them. How about those on that left end, the cheapest? I mean, are any of them any good in terms of bench measurements or people liking them? You know, the Zygo G90, which is not in this data set, I sent Rob my G90 I purchased from MFJ unopened. And that's the one he used to do bench measurements and has it on his tables now, but it's not in it. But the G90 is either loved or hated. It's like the VW Beetle. It's cheap. It gets you there. It doesn't use much gas. Yeah, it's kind of bumpy on the roads. It's not, a Rolls Royce or a Bentley. Doesn't ride like one, but I love it. It's a great little rig. Oh, I hate it. I sold mine. So those on the low end, do we have any VW Beetles there? We're going to find out. So let's look at the received performance, and a shameless promotion. And Martin, tell Colin to add this to my check because I'm mentioning the podcast a lot tonight. If you look at episodes 305, you'll hear my interview with Rob Sherwood, and he goes into great detail over how he approaches his bench test, what his observations are about rigs over the years. And I've been able to confirm some of his impressions with some of this research. And if you go to episode 312 of the ICQ podcast, Bob Allison, who just retired from the ARL test lab, I interviewed him about the same topic. So you can learn a lot more about these tests. And I also encourage you to look at the Sherwin Engineering documentation on his website. Many people misread what his table rankings mean. I'll comment on that in a minute. Well, one problem is that he uses a number of measurements. He ranks his table, however, on one category, and that is close-in dynamic range. How powerful of a rejection do you have there for a strong signal that you don't want to hear relative to the one that you do hear? Well, why is that the most important? Well, it's no surprise. He says this in my interview with him. He's a CW contester, and that's the single best criterion to Rob Sherwood for measuring a rig's received performance. And I have no doubt about that. I don't question that whatsoever. But not every ham is a CW operator, and not every ham is a contest participant. So another aspect of the receiver's performance might be more relevant. Well, what can you do? Here's a little screenshot of his tables, and you'll see for the FT DX 101D and the Flex 6700, you'll see the measures of noise floor, AGC threshold, the blocking factor at 1 kilohertz, the sensitivity, the local oscillator noise, and so on and so on. He ranks it on narrow in dynamic range. So this column is his single most important feature of this. Well, if we were to do this study and do it separately for each of these somewhat, 9 maybe, or 8 or 9 measurements, we'd come out with 8 or 9 different results. Well, then what do we do? How do we make sense of that? So and then it would be a little more subjective about some objective measurements. So to deal with that, I put them all together in a statistical way. And it's made sense to Rob. And I want to point this out. This column right here, what's called the loading. When you put all of these measurements together, this is how important each one is to the overall single measurement. And guess what? His favorite, the close-in dynamic range, is one of the most important factors, along with the ultimate filtering and the local oscillator noise spacing. Notice that, as Rob says, noise floor just isn't very relevant anymore. Well, it's got the lowest weight here in the overall index. Now, this is a statistical procedure that we call principal components. It's been used in amateur radio since the 1950s in propagation studies. And it says, okay, if I put these things together, how many different aspects will it take to represent all of them? And this is called a scree plot. I had to tell Rick Lindquist at National Contesting Journal to take the bloody N off a scree. It's not a screen plot. This is a geological term, scree. If any of you are geologists, you'll know scree are those little pebbles that gather around the base of a hill where it plateaus. And so when Raymond Cattell developed this, you'll see this line. And this line is how it helps you make a judgment over how many of these components does it take. So this first component is about 41% of all of the variation here. And you can see it dominates the data. So this is a single measurement that a high score means it's a better receiver, and a low score means it's not so good. So these 9 bench measurements were able to be put together in a way that makes a lot of sense both to me and according to Rob Sherwood, him as well. So that's our measure of performance. So here's what that performance index looks like. The median is 100. So this is a way that this is simply scale. So if your favorite rig has got a score of 100, it's right in the middle of the pack. But I want to point out a couple of things. you've got, now this thing is a mean of 100, but a standard deviation, which is a measure of this spread. How spread out is it? Okay. The standard deviation is 15. Let's just look. We take 15 away from 100. Okay. We're going to go to 85. Then we're going to take 15 away and we're going to get to 70. That's 2 standard deviations. We'll look at this normal curve. You have a very small proportion of rigs that are under these tails. So you've got some that are 3 standard deviations away from the center. And look on the upside. We've got some rigs that just are outstanding in their performance. They are 3 times 15 is 45, I think. So we've got some that are 45 points above the average. Rob had never seen this, and I think it helped him, put some of his thoughts in line. So it kind of fits a little bit of a normal curve, and it gives us a little more confidence, I think, in this measurement technique. Well, satisfaction. Here's one of the issues about the EHAM ratings, and I hear hams argue about this. Many hams want to make the EHAM reviews into bench tests like Rob Sherwood or the RSGB or the ARL does. They are not. If you buy a car and the car manufacturer sends you a survey or calls you and says, Mr. Butler, you just bought Mrs. B a car. We want to know what you think about it. Well, did they expect you to take your wrenches out and take it apart and do a bench test on it? I think they probably hoped that you didn't. What they want to know is your satisfaction as a consumer. And I left Chris Howard out. He's got a new buggy as well, got a new camper. So they're wanting to know how satisfied you are with that product, not have you taken it apart as a mechanic or as an electronic engineer. It's a complete experience with the rig and sometimes the reseller. Now, I want to tell you something, 126 rigs. I read every review on EHAM for every rig at least twice, some as many as 5 times. Okay. So I've read what people have said. And if you listen to them, they're really telling you their thoughts. And some people say, yeah, but you need to focus on them out. They don't know what they're talking about. Well, they spent the money and they've got the radio and they're using it like you do. If you start down that road, then you're saying some people don't know what you know. And it may be true. You've got some people who are engineers who do some ratings, and some they're just kind of like the average Joe or Jane that buys them. But that's why you shouldn't make the EHAM thing into a bench test. It is a consumer satisfaction. So I used the cumulative average on EHAM for the rig in 2019 when I put this together. So it's not measured just after the release, but that's what the satisfaction measurement is. Here's what it looks like. So the average satisfaction from a 1 to 5 scale is about 4.7. That means that, and I hate to be this blunt, but there are some dogs over here in terms of how people like them. And we're going to identify a couple of them. And so you really got to have people that really don't like your radio to not get over 4. Those that are down here, they don't do well because if anything, it's skewed to a positive end. I hear people say, oh, you just get the people unhappy with radios. Not true. In fact, it's the opposite. You almost wonder, do they really like the radios that well? Well, I don't know. This is what they had to say. Could be a halo effect. I'll tell you one thing that I'm doing. I've done a test flight with this. I've got to update the script because I've already done it a few years ago. I'm scraping every review, the narrative, and I'm going to use some natural language processing and what some people call artificial intelligence. It isn't really, but do some sentiment analysis of what they wrote, what they said. So give me a year, maybe I'll have that done. I'm going to do that for every review of everything on EHAM. So we'll see who's got the best in class rating, who's got the worst in class rating. Give me a little bit of time, but I do plan to do that, as well as look at the individual reviews, not just the average. All right, let's look at some of the results. Here on the left, I've got the year of the review of the 10 most expensive rigs and the 10 least expensive radios. That's whatever the dollar value written on the little ticket when they came out. Here it's been updated to 2019 US dollars. Notice the Hilberling, 17,500 in 2014. The Collins 390. Those are, you can find those on eBay for kind of, you may not get $23,000, but that's what it would be in today's dollars. They were expensive then, they're expensive now. So the Hilberling has kind of gone up a little bit. The Raycal, I've always had a fond, warm, fuzzy feeling for Raycal. Maybe it's because I couldn't find one. And so you can kind of go through some, like here's a receiver. The ICOM flagship. Here's another Collins, and so on. Then look down here at the bottom. The old Frog 7700. I had a Frog 7000 when I finished my PhD. That was my reward. Is I bought a Frog 7000 receiver. The old Heathkit. Look at the FT891. I have one of those. Enjoy it. Take it portably. So you've got quite a variation, and I want you to keep some of these rigs in mind as we go through the results, because I think it will be surprising and it might make a point about how price can figure into whether something works well on receive or whether Mikey likes it. All right, and here's on satisfaction and performance. Notice, remember we had what it cost. Now let's look here. Oops, that Hilberling cost a lot, but Mikey didn't like it quite as much. It only got a 4. The Drake R4, which is the very radio that got Rob Sherwood into testing because he didn't necessarily agree with ARL's bench test and what his own experience in contest were. Apache Anon, the FT 101. Okay, let's look at the performance. Whereas when Rob ranks them, this one gets the highest, it gets the top rank only because of narrowband dynamic range. The Flex 66 edges it out just a little bit. It's basically no difference here. So when we misread Rob's tables, well, mine was ranked 4th. Yeah, but it might not have been really any different just because it was ranked. I mean, something's got to be 4th. So we look at the Elecraft and look at the performance of the Hilberling. Some people didn't like it, and people paid a lot of money for it, but it seemed to be not too bad, about a standard deviation less than the top. So, and here's the bottom rigs. Let me say that Chris has the PDF of the slides, and so he can send them to you if you want. If you don't get the National Contesting Journal, if you will, I'm good on QRZ. I'm good on the ICQ podcast webpage. So you can send me an email and I'll email you the 2 PDFs of the NCJ articles. Okay. All right. So there's top and bottom rigs. So I wanted you to pay attention to some of those because you'll see some of them that have come out here. This one has kind of come out and got some attention. Let's look at the trends in price. The red is the price when we've adjusted for inflation. The blue is the original price. And we go from about 1954 to rigs coming out the year they were introduced to 2019. Now, some of this will be jumpy simply because this is not every rig introduced, only the ones in Rob Sherwood's tables, some 126. So you can see that the price got down to the median over all of them of about $3,177. And look at when it pops up. And you'll find that these were periods of inflation. back in the late 80s. Japan was a very hot economy. We had a lot of inflation, at least here in the States, and boom, it popped up. We had another jump up here in 2010 here. Now, these are explainable by shifts in the economy. There was also explainable by what happened around 2010. We had the introduction of what some call the premium transceiver. I don't know that ICOM invented that, but they may well have, and we'll see here in a moment. So this is the trends in the prices over time. It spiked around 1990 and again in 2010. I look at performance. Rob has said in the interview I had with him, as well as some others, we've got the best receivers now than we've ever had. Well, he's not wrong, because the average over the time periods here, and then you get the measured bench performance, boom, popped up here, meanders, and then look about 2004. Once 2008 hits, there's a takeoff. Well, what's happened? Well, there's a couple of things happened. The microchip industry got economies of scale just cooking. We had a great shift in the design of these radios, along with other RF products. Lots of transistors in one microchip. And we had the rise of the software-defined radio. We'll come back to that, but look at what's happened. We have the best receivers during this period, as far as measuring it on a bench, than we've ever had. There's 2 standard deviations above the series average. Now let's look at the satisfaction on EHAM. Boy, what kind of gobbledygook is this? This looks very strange, doesn't it? These little tan boxes are box and whisker plots, and for the pre-1970 rigs, just taken by themselves, this is their median satisfaction, and then 75% of them are between these hinges here. So it shows you visually the center of the distribution within that time period and the variation, and you can get quite a bit of variation. Like there was less variation here and less variation in the 90s. A lot of variation here. Okay, I'm just going to deal with not the elephant in the room, but the barking dog in the room. One of those dogs that we discovered in that one is the old ICOM R72. I've never owned one, but the people who do just don't like it on EHAM. It got the lowest rating in all of the rigs on Sherwood's tables here. I suspect the U.S. representative, Ray Novak, doesn't like me saying that, but that's the way the data come out. Well, what's this individual line? When you look at this, this is the individual radios during that period, and they jump all over the place. And Rob Sherwood and I went through this quite a bit to try to understand it. But what happens is that's a function of the rigs that he chose, or the fact that he didn't test everything. Let me put it that way. That what he chose, really changed. There were some winners and there were some losers. But overall, for 50 years, the average EHAM rating of the rigs in Sherwood table is the same, with that exception of pre-1970. They were all having a median score about what they are now. Some winners, some losers, but they're about the same. Well, if you saw that movie, Finding Nemo, finding the optimal rig. If you haven't just taken your wallet out or your Apple Pay or whatever, it said, here's all my money, just give me a good rig. You can take these data and you could do what I've done. You could look them up, you could put them together, and you could say, okay, this has got that and this has got the other. And I know a few hams who've taken a spreadsheet and done that, but the problem with it is putting them together. So I use something that people in the business world use frequently, and that's called quadrant analysis. That if you've got a couple of criteria, how much does it cost, and does the customer like it? Well, what do you want? The customer wants lower cost and high satisfaction. That's called the Golden Quadrant that we want. So I've done that with this, but because, as my wife likes to remind me, you can go broke saving money. You know, you have stores say, come in, we've got a so-and-so discount on all our furniture. Well, if you buy enough furniture, you can save $1 million, but you may have spent 10 million by the time you've saved all that money. So I computed a performance for the price variable using the ones that I've already showed you. So a bang for the buck. And then how does that look for major manufacturers over a 50-year period? So let me just illustrate what this is. We've got 4 quadrants. We've got the EHAM satisfaction score. You know, Mikey really likes the high ones. Mikey really doesn't like the low ones. And here's the Sherwood Performance Index, with 100 being the median. So high performance by Sherwood. A lot of hams like it. That's where we want to be, right? Well, how much does it cost? Well, I've got these color coded. So a solid blue dot like this means it was in the lowest 25%, the lowest percentile of all the rigs. They were $1,900 or less. The green dot, let's just illustrate this one. Well, it was between 1,900 and 3,100. You remember the median was 3,177. The tan diamond, which here's a Kenwood rig, well, it's above average in price, but it receives very well on the bench and people like it. And then the highest price ones that were over $4,800 are the red circles. And you got some over here. So I'm going to go to the next slide, and it's just going to have just this quadrant so you can actually see it. So you've got low performance, high satisfaction, low performance, low satisfaction, etc. The optimal quad. And let's see. Now, this is that golden quadrant. So you can see what are some of the rigs that seem to do the best on Sherwood's bench. Mikey really likes it on the satisfaction. And let's see what the cost. As I said, the Kenwood TS 890 is a little above average. It does well, not as well as these 2 flex radios, and not as well as the Yaesu or the ICOM. I don't know if Kenwood calls the 990 or the 890 its flagship. The 890 is supposed to have some better circuitry, so you know who knows. But Kenwood certainly came up. The 890 came up here in measurement. The flagship for ICOM 891. All these are, really good. I mean, they are really good. Now you're going to pay above average for them. So if you wanted kind of sort of similar performance, but with a little less collective satisfaction, these 2 flex rigs seem to be the best performers. The KX3 from Elecraft, you know, they're down here in these lower quadrants. So here's where it comes to the consumer. How much do you want to spend? And is the fact that you've got to deal with an SDR, how do you feel about that? Are you fluent in doing that? Is that a good thing? They'll give you a knob. This M's got a screen and a knob on it if you want that. The 6400, like I have, it doesn't have a knob. Deal with it with a computer. They'll sell you a little iPad in the box and that kind of thing. They'll even give you a knob you can plug into your computer, the flex control. So if you don't like that, and a lot of hams don't like that, you just read the eHam reviews and they don't like it. You know, but look at what you're going to pay. So those are rigs. When you look at price, you look at consumer satisfaction, and you look at measured performance, putting them together. I've not seen anyone do this. So putting them together to help you take some of them out of the picture. I mean, let's face it, if money was the primary criterion, what would we all be doing? We would be saving our shekels to buy a Hilberling. All right. So now, when you look at EHAM, or you go to a rally, or you're on a Zoom meeting like this where people are just talking, I bet you won't have any discussion of an HF rig where you don't have, well, that's a great rig for the money. You hear that with the Xiegu G90. It's $400 about, and I think on Amazon Prime Day it was $399. You get a lot of rig for the money. It's a very common theme. The ICOM 7300 has redefined the bar on a lot for the money. It has almost single-handedly killed the used HF rig market, because why buy your used rig when they can buy a new 7300? So to look at that, I created another variable. I took the price variable and put it into the metric like the Sherwood performance is. So it's a mean price of 100, standard deviation of 15. So I got a ratio. And if the ratio is 1, that means your price and your performance are both median. If your ratio is greater than 1, that means you get a better performance for the dollar, more bang for the buck. If it's less than 1, that means you're not getting the bang for the buck that you would in some other. So let's look at that. Well, here is the same graph with the quadrants, with the performance to price ratio, the median being a 1. So all those to the right, they get an above average bang for the buck. Those to the left, less the case. And then here's the satisfaction. Well, once again, I mean, you want the greatest bang for your buck, right? I mean, if you like just kind of taking that wallet and giving it away, then that's your choice. But most of us, clearly, we want to get the most for the least, because then we can buy some more ham gear, right? What we didn't spend. But you also want people to like it and that sort of thing. And then on that thing that my wife reminds me of sometimes, you got to look at the absolute price of a rig, no matter if there's a lot of bang for the buck, because you're going to pay an absolute dollar value for it. So I've done the same thing here with the price in quartiles up in this little golden quadrant here. And look, some of the names you've got. The Apache Anon does quite well up there with the Yaesu FTDX 101. And I think when Martin did the interview with the UK Yaesu folks, when that just came out, that may have broken that story over in the UK. They're very proud of that rig, and they should be. It set the scale for Rob Sherwood in the close-in dynamic range, and it's a bang for the buck rig. I mean, it's not bad at all. But look at the little KX2. It's QRP, and that may not be what you want. But wow, it's a tremendous bang for the buck. The K3S is. I have a TS 590SG. My first HF radio was a venerable TS 830S, the hybrid with tubes for the transmitter. Kenwood, I have some subjectivity for Kenwood. I like the audio, but let me just tell you that Kenwood moved the needle when they upgraded the S to the SG. I don't have it illustrated here, but it actually moved. Well, let me point something else out to you. Here's that Hilberling. Now, if you want to spend that amount of money, go ahead. You know, that's okay. But if you buy a Bentley, you're not doing it to save gas. You know, that's the thing you got to keep in mind. So you might want a Hilberling. You might want a Collins. You know, you might want a Raquel. I still like to have a Raquel. I wouldn't necessarily want it for the performance, but it's just a subjective thing. So when you look at the bang for the buck, these are some rigs that kind of come into it. Well, here's the message. Some of the beloved rigs just do not perform well in terms of receiving performance, either in the absolute terms or relative to their price. And many of them are in the highest price quartile. We buy them anyway because we just want to. So here's the message. Money might buy you love, but love can cost an awful lot. Okay. Now, these are some that if you don't have an affair of the heart with a brand or a particular rig, a very rational approach would be begin looking at this quadrant. I'm going to have them listed here in just a moment. And this Kenwood, this is why I bought this Kenwood after I did this study, by the way. I've got a good friend who's got one, and I've had Kenwood before, but when I looked at this, it's in a real sweet spot. So for me personally, I just wanted to have a Kenwood 590 SG. I also bought a 6400 as well. So let's then put these in a bigger framework. I took this list. Every one of them are in that top performance to price category. These are the top bang for the buck, the top 25% bang for the buck rigs. And I classified them and a little bit subjectively, but here they are. And, you know, you can do them differently. It looked to me like there were three groups of them. Those that I have in green, they were in what I call the sweet spot. They're in the top EHAM quartile. So over 75% really liked them. They were above the median. Excuse me. They were above the median in the EHAM. They're all in the top price performance. So they're in the sweet spot category. And they include the Elecraft KX2, the K3S, the 590SG, the receiver only, the ICOM ICR 8600. And if you've seen one of those at a rally, you don't want to walk away from it if they've got an antenna hooked to it, because you sit there and just listen to that thing for a long time. And guess what? The Drake R4C that got Sherwood started. There are people today that say for CW, that's still one of the best rigs out there. Well, the second group, what I call hot rods, they were the highest performers objectively on the Sherwood index, but they were in the second quartile of EM, but they were below the median price. And so the three hot rods are the two Flex 6600M and 6400, and then the little Elecraft KX3, the little QRP radio. And then the third group that I distinguished was what I call the contender. You know, they almost won the championship, but it was just didn't quite get there. They were all in the top quartile of price to performance, and people liked them. They're in the top EHAM, but they just cost more than average. And so these are the FTDX 101, the Kenwood TS 890, and the Apache Anon 7000. So your mileage may vary. You've got the ICOM IC 7300 here. You've got both the 590S and the 590SG here, the little QRP Flex SDR, the K3 that a lot of contesters have used, and my beloved Perseus radio that I'll admit it here, I paid $1,400 for it. And look at what you can buy today from SDR Play for a great SDR radio. But anyway, those are kind of what I would call an optimal list. So how much does the price effect that price have on performance? Well, there's an inconsistent pattern of price thus far. You don't find the same rigs everywhere. Just buying a random high price rig does not guarantee that you're going to get a rig. I said earlier, you just throw a bunch of money, surely you'll get a good rig. Maybe not. Can we put a finer point on it? I'll step through this. So we used a linear regression model, and I'll look at this pretty quickly here. For the Sherwood Performance Index, I'll hit some high points. Of all of the differences in the set of Sherwood tests 2/3 of them are related to price, the decade it was built, whether one of the major manufacturers built it. Price, now this coefficient here ranges from 0 to 1. Well, it's a 0.34. If price drove everything, that would be much, much higher. Excuse me, because this controls for the decade it was built and who built it. So if price was the driving force, if throwing money at it was going to get you performance, then this would be a higher number. Look at what happened over time relative to 2010 and beyond. Almost 2 standard deviations, poorer performance. Little less. The 2000s, still a standard deviation, less. The 2010 and beyond, as Rob has said, the best we've ever had, regardless of price. This is the importance of this table. Regardless of price, they're still the best performers in 2010. And look for the manufacturer. There are only 2 that make a difference, and they're not who you would think they would be. They're not part of the so-called big 3. Elecraft, when you control for price and what year they were made, they're over a standard deviation better on receive. Flex, any of them, are almost a standard deviation better. So, and that's something to keep in mind here. With satisfaction, there's only one thing that makes much of a difference, and that is price. But notice that its effect on satisfaction is smaller than its effect on performance. None of the rest of them are significant. So money makes a difference, but only for certain rigs and in certain years. That's the take-home message. You can see that here when we look at performance to price and what decade the radio was introduced to the market. The black line is everybody else besides Elecraft, Flex, ICOM, Kenwood, and Yaesu. All the other rigs came in and meandered through, and they finished at the bottom in the post-2010 era. ICOM came in with the purple line, and it finished next, followed by Yaesu and Kenwood. And look at what happened. Flex and Elecraft entered the market. Remember, we looked at that graph where price and performance, when it started peaking and spiking up, Flex and Elecraft entered the market, and they've continued to have a better performance to price ratio than any of the other manufacturers. Boy, that looks pretty sophisticated. You know, it'd take a PhD statistician to come up with that. That's just noise. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain, because that's just noise. None of it's significant. Okay, so the satisfaction score, it fluctuates on a lot of reasons, and I'll end my comments with why. So I found no study of this kind, so it's new results. It's a unique opportunity to investigate how do you know which rig is best without throwing away money. Let me try to be clear. What is best is idiosyncratic to you. But overall, I presented some of the results there. If you read the EHAM narratives, the top-rated rig will inevitably have a few hams who say it's a dog for very particularistic readings. I think I read one of them that they didn't like the packaging. Okay, so but their satisfaction is valid to them. To you, you've got to think about what is best for you. I hope this helped you narrow it down in terms of an HF rig. Price is related to performance and satisfaction, just not as much as we like to tell each other and ourselves. We're in the best period of receivers we've ever been in, and it's not even close. Satisfaction depends on a number of things, but receive performance is only one of them, and price is only one of them. Here is, I think, something to take home. It's amazing what we're willing to pay for features that I haven't measured in this study. I'm not sure we can reliably measure the features in all those rigs. We have some features today that weren't invented back in the 50s and 60s. Ergonomics. You hear a lot of people talk about the little G90. Yeah, the screen's too small. I can't read it. What was the problem with the ICOM 7300 where you hear people who will badmouth it? What do they say? Why didn't they put a VGA port on the back? They did with their next rig. Why do you think they didn't put one on the 7300? Because you'd buy the cheaper 7300 rather than the higher priced rig. So when you look at features, it's amazing what we want and how important features are. But I will say, no matter whether you wear a hat from one manufacturer or a shirt from one manufacturer or another and claim you're a Kenwood guy, you're an ICOM guy or gal or Yaesu or whoever, why do you think they give that stuff away at rallies? They want you to wear it. No matter. These data show that some kind of brand loyalty just doesn't make much difference. Just doesn't make much difference. So the two that pop out of here are Elecraft and Flex radio systems. If you just want to go on measured performance and performance per price, some of them actually have very good satisfaction ratings. Flex suffers a little bit in this regard relative to Elecraft, so that's something to keep in mind. It's hard to go wrong with the rig in that Golden Quadrant, at least as far as I can tell. The two-part series of this was published in January, February, and March, April 2021 issues of National Contesting Journal. Their graphics are terrible. Email me, look at the slides that Chris has. Email me with any follow-up questions. When I've given this talk, I get questions from people, and I'm happy to try to engage and do the best I can. No study's perfect. This one certainly is not. I plan to go back over the next year and add the transmission bench test that QST's had. I don't know if there's enough of them rated there with the same measurements. I hope to come up with a transmission performance index and add that, and also scrape the EHAM database for the individual reviews, the rating and the narrative, and include the individual ratings in a revised analysis so we can see even more details about why and what people say they like or dislike about radios. So thank you for watching and listening. I know it's getting late in the evening. Those of you who are still awake and you want to ask a question, I'm more than happy to. So I know Martin's got to get up at stupid o'clock, and he can't sleep past stupid 30. So Chris?
Yeah, guys, if you got any questions, you should now be able to unmute yourself. So feel free to do that. And so Frank, thank you very much. By the way, that was an excellent talk, and I'm sure the guys found that, especially ones that are just about to make a purchase, perhaps found that useful. So, guys, if you got any questions, please feel free to unmute and fire away.
I'm just going to say 73 to you all, because as Frank said, I'm up at stupid o'clock. Frank, you haven't replied to me about Saturday, but if you can make it, it'd be great. If not, I'll speak to you soon.
I plan to make it. I think I replied and said, if it's on Saturday, I'll try to make it. So I'll see you. I'll see you Saturday.
I'll see you Saturday, Frank. Have a good one. 73 for the rest of you, and hopefully I'll catch up with you soon.
Cheers, Martin.
Cheers.
So, are you doing the quiz this Sunday then?
So yeah, anybody got any questions that they might want to put to Frank after that? Huge amount of research, Frank, you've done there from what I could see.
Wow. Yeah, Chris.
Yeah, got him.
Hi, Frank. Fascinating talk, and I loved the analysis. It was really inspiring, and makes you feel like you want to spend a whole load more money and get a new rig. But my particular question is, for the rigs that are not listed on the Sherwood analysis, is there any way of incorporating those rigs in any way to sort of benchmark them against the ones that are there, as it were?
Well, Tim, that's a great question. And I wish there were, but without, I'm a statistician. I've been called in by the government and by industry to help sort out fistfights in the kitchen over, does one pesticide work better than the other? Does this work better? Does that work better? And so forth. And without getting out on a limb that may not be very defensible, I would say, Tim, that to do that, and I'd love for somebody to correct me and show me the way, show me the shining path by which that could be done without getting into some very speculative assumptions that you'd have to make to be able to generalize that. Because look, let's just face it. You can take, let's just take the TS 590S and the SG. It bumped up a bit, yet the 590S still wound up in that performance to price. So what does that mean? Well, let's say the 590S was not in the data set like you're talking about. Well, we could look at that one rig very carefully and make a reasonable assumption. Okay, here's what they changed in the SG versus the S. They fixed the overshoot problem, which might have been done by firmware anyway. I'm not sure whether that was something that they actually changed in the circuitry or they updated the firmware. I'd have to go back and look. But the point being is we might, something that's a close design, we might be able to make some inferences. But it would take you a long time. You would have to have enough of the technical documents to really understand the design of the radio. And I'm just afraid, Tim, that you just kind of get out on some real speculation. So I wish there was a good answer to your question or a way that your question could be addressed. Keep in mind, now, we have a open position at ARRL to fill Bob Allison's shoes. They have not hired his replacement. I've encouraged them very strongly, don't drop the ball. That's a gold standard. You've got to keep this up. Now, keep in mind, too, Rob Sherwood, he's not getting any younger. He's closed his company already. At some point, he'll quit doing this. So, I'm afraid that we have what we have.
I guess a lot of people,
rigs, Tim.
Yeah. No, sorry, Frank. I guess a lot of people, well, I don't know a lot, but a number of people like me may have rigs that they're not the latest necessarily, but you just like to, and they're quite popular rigs that like the 817, 818, I couldn't see listed. I haven't been through it in detail, but, and I guess they'd just like to see how much of a performance gap is there between that and some of the others you might be considering?
Sure. Well, there's a couple of things, that you could do. Now, here's how the one reason I mentioned the interview I did on the podcast is because he goes into how he gets rigs. He will not take one from a manufacturer. Will not do it. Because what, I would, if I were a manufacturer, I would make sure I'd check it out and make darn sure it was a good one. So he had a deal where he could go into the ham radio outlet store in Denver and get one on loan, the manufacturer, but he went up and picked the radio. He had so many people asking him about the Zygo G90 that he told me in a conversation, he says, I guess I'm going to have to test the G9. I'm getting so many people. I said, Rob, I bought one 2 months ago from MFJ while I was up at the factory. I'm up there about every 3 months. I used to teach there at Mississippi State in the building next door to Martin Jew, by the way, when he was an electrical engineering professor. So I'm up there about every 3 months. And so I just picked one up and I hadn't opened it. I said, look, I'll just give it to FedEx. They'll send it to you. I've never opened it. It's the same as you going into a store and getting it. Nothing's been done to it. You test it and I'll pay shipping to you. You pay shipping back. And so he did that and he has the results now up on his page. So what you could do, for example, if you had a rig, if you found someone who did bench measurements, even someone that if you could get them to do the same bench measurements and follow the same protocol, you could take those results and then compare them to what Rob has. on his. So, I mean, that would be the only thing on the bench measurement side, Tim. But that's why I took out the radios that were not rated on EHAM. You can't make that stuff up, because what would you expect the old ICOM R72 to be? It would be, you'd expect it to be like the other ICOMs, right? No, it's not. Terribly so. So for whatever reason, I mean, and I've never had one, so it, you know. But look, Tim, let me just tell you, I have a Drake TR7. It's your father's Buick automobile, if you Buick here in the States. I've got a Swan 550CX, and if I'm not on frequency, just stay there. I'll be there sooner or later because it drifts. I may get rid of those, but probably not. Are they a performer? No, but I love seeing the tubes in the Swan heat up. I love hearing the rush of that, and when it tunes up, you dip the grid. I love the dual passband tuning and the smoothness of the Drake TR7. I gave Martin Jew a refurbished TR7 for his 45th anniversary as a friend of mine, because he said, when I got mine, he said, well, you know, Frank, that's the rig I always wanted. Well, I mean, here's a guy who owns MFJ Enterprises. He could probably buy a Hilberling if that's what he wanted, you know. So I got one and gave it to him. So we all have some rigs like that, Tim, that we have. They're an affair of the heart, not of the bench. And stuff. So that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. So I keep two of them around for my shack.
Thank you, Frank.
Yes.
Thanks, Tim. Anybody else got any questions for Frank before we finish up? Oh,
I've got to hear from Leslie. I saw him in the crowd.
Yeah, Leslie's not on mute, so I'm sure he's got something to say.
Hi, Frank. We're good to meet up with you again.
Yes.
I'll do that. That's better. Good evening, Frank. Great to meet up with you again.
Yes.
A couple of things I've sort of been writing down. I've been scribbling out your notes and some of the things that I'm going to have to look up. Anyway, the first thing I sort of noticed was that you're trying to sort of go down the tightrope of, on the one hand, subjective feelings of the consumer.
Yes.
Which is, like you're saying, the affairs of the heart and all the other things. And on the other side of the tightrope is the factual measurements.
Right.
And that's a very difficult thing. And the other thing I sort of wrote down was consumers are irrational.
Well, we are, aren't we? It's like whether you should dunk your pork pie or not. Some say yes, some say no. Well, let me respond. That's an inside podcast joke, folks.
Oh, yeah.
But let me respond to that because you raised two very, very, very good questions. Let's think about how we buy a rig, because I should have mentioned this. You know, when we go to a restaurant, a nice restaurant, we sometimes order a la carte. I want this for my entree, but I don't want what you have for the sides with it. I want that and the other. And for dessert, I want something different. Wow, we don't get much of that when we buy an HF transceiver. We don't get to say, I want a noise floor of this. I want a close-in dynamic range of that. I want this, that, and the other. Now, there are a few that give you some options. Granted, you know, you can buy a filter with it. You can buy a TXCO. You can buy a voice module. Yeah, there's a little a la carte. But the fundamentals that's in Rob's test, you get what the engineer designed and was realized in the manufactured product, right?
They're a measurement.
I mean, and that's what you've got. So, you know, that's what you get. You don't get to order a la carte very much. And so one of the things that I hope this study does is it gets people to think about the EHAM stuff and their own use of it. And they're saying, you are an idiot for saying that about my favorite rig. You're stupid. Well, they may be all of that, or it could be you. On the other hand, they're just as valid as you are. And so read them with the framework of, okay, the ones that didn't like it, why didn't they like it? I need to go back and find the one. I think one of them said it was terrible packaging. Well, I mean, look, it didn't show up in pieces. I mean, it got to you, right? And you're not using the packaging every day. So some of the reasons that people said they rated high or low, we might say is rubbish. But then look at that with it. When I get to the individual ratings, and I'm going to do a little of this natural language processing to measure sentiment, what is it people say about ICOM rigs? What is it people say about Yaesu rigs or this particular one? I hope to be able to get some measurements, some more measurements, Leslie, of that irrationality. We'll see.
Fascinating stuff. Thank you for the talk, Frank. It was great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. Okay, anybody else got anything else for Frank before we wrap things up?
Listen, I will tell you, I have promised Chris that the next time you can't get a good speaker, let me know and I'll find you one. So
I gotta say, in my comments, Frank, I mean, EHAM I tend to find, and it sounds like you've read a lot more of it than I have. It tends to be a little bit like TripAdvisor. Some people put really bad review. If you look at just for one particular radio, you'll see lots of like 1 stars and lots of 5 stars, and not that much in between. But I don't know, is that what you found when you looked through it?
no, it's really skewed toward a halo effect. You know, as many people would say, well, only the negative people come out and rate these things. Well, not on EHAM and not for these rigs. When if my aspirations and my behavior get together, that is, I put my butt in the seat long enough and get it done, I'm going to actually do a little bit of this for all of the categories of ham products, because I want to see if some of this makes sense. As Leslie kind of indicated, let's look at the rationality. Another way of looking at irrational is someone uses a rationality that's not synonymous with yours. So let's try to figure out what the metric, of that is. So, but for the rigs in Rob Sherwood's table, Chris, there tended to be a skew toward the positive. That's why I'm picking on the lonely ICOM 72 R72A or whatever it was. Man, that one got kicked to the curb badly because you had to be really poorly seen in the ratings to be down there less than 3.5 or something. I mean, it was pretty bad. So no, there's a halo effect here. So the naysayers didn't show up. If anything. So one way you can look at it is if it has an average rating of less than 4.7, then it's in the lower half, of all the ratings for the HF rigs that were in Sherwood's table. So this is a little different. I was a little surprised, Chris.
Yeah, because I always think that build motivation for putting a review on there. Are they sort of almost like warning people not to buy it, or are they bragging about the radio they bought, or
Yeah, I think you have both. And look, let me just tell you, and I will do this. There's a little statistical procedure that looks at trend data over time. It's called a runs test, and no joke, it's called the runs test. And that means that as the data moves, is there a tendency for, if there's a negative, is there then a positive right after it? And I've watched this without putting a statistical pencil to it. You watch on EHAM, when somebody comes out and really dogs a product, within the next day or two, somebody will come in and say it's the best thing since Lee DeForest invented the vacuum tube. I mean, you watch, there will be the defenders of that. So I think there's a little of those dynamics. And the truth of the matter is, when you see something that's negative and you have one and you like it, when you see someone say it's terrible, you think, well, I need to put my review in. So it kind of motivates you to get engaged. But, over time, these things tend to cancel one another, those on the kind of the extremes, unless there really is a positive opinion or there really is a negative opinion. Let me say something I didn't include in that regression table when I got to the satisfaction. Rob Sherwood, as well as Mark Wilson at ARRL, who shared, he told me about how they do their price data. They said, well, you know, what if you have a small number of reviews? Well, you know, when we get down below 30 in statistics, we begin to look at some variation that you get a little queasy stomach over. It's called asymptotic relative efficiency, if you want to know the brand name of it. Well, I put the number of reviews into that model and it had no effect. And so I looked at it very carefully because Rob Sherwood raised that distance and raised that question. Here's what you find on small numbers of reviews. It doesn't mean they're going to be negative, and it doesn't mean they're going to be positive. If you've got, say, 5 reviews on a product or a rig, it can just as be all 5s, or it could just as be, 4s. So there's no real bias in the small number of reviews. You would like to have more, but there isn't any bias you can measure, in terms of the small number. But yeah, there's some dynamics here. And as Leslie said, it's like the golfer, Bobby Jones here in the States, when Jack Nicklaus came out, he said, he plays a game of which I'm not familiar. So some people have a rationality that we might not be familiar with, but that's why we do research, right? I mean, to me, it's kind of fun to look at what people say. They say it consistently. They say it in writing. It's there. And it's the only thing we have. I mean, that's the thing about it is, keep this in mind. If you had millions of dollars and you went to all the manufacturers and says, I want a list of everybody who bought the IC 7300 or the Collins 390A, they don't know, because resellers then resell them. And guess what happens with resellers? Some of them don't want to tell the manufacturer who they sold to. You know why? Because then the manufacturer decides to open up their own online store and they suck up all the business, and they've got a marketing database. So I've had some resellers from here in the States anyway. Actually, and one over on your side of the pond, I won't name that 2-letter name of the company, who told me that we don't want the manufacturer knowing who we sell to, because we can easily get cut out of the retail chain. So there's really no way that we could have a universe to do the kind of research that, by a textbook we'd like to have. So the EHAM is the best we have. The Sherwood tables, or a consistent compilation from RSGB or QST, they may do slightly different measurements. And, Sherwood's taken ARL to task some on some of their receiver measurements, particularly when they got to SDR measurements. So that, and that's good science to have some of that worked out, because some of the measurements on SDRs don't make as much sense as they do on superhits, for example. So, but you got your points well taken, but unfortunately, I'm afraid it's all we have and may ever have.
Cool. Anybody else got any final comments or questions before we finish up?
Yeah, I've got a quick question, Chris.
Yeah, go on, Bob.
Good evening, Frank. Thank you for a very interesting talk. Is there any merit in doing any sort of weighting or reviewing on the basis of things like the user interface? I appreciate these are very subjective topics. I've just bought an FTDX10, which I think is an excellent rig, but frankly, the user interface leaves a bit to be desired. So I just wondered what the thinking would be on if you tried to rate them along those lines.
Bob, that's just an outstanding question, and one that I have struggled with. When you look at the features, because I think one comeuppance to these results is just how important what you said is, how important features are. Because particularly in the post-2010 era, if you're talking about the newest class of radios, right? They are all great receivers. There are some that are not as good, but for the most part, they're all great receivers. So it's amazing what we're willing to spend on features and perhaps ergonomics, to the extent that ergonomics are different from features, and we could debate that. But here's Bob. Here's some of the things I've been toying with. I've been toying with going back, because I did a lot of looking, of going back for each rig and look at the manufacturer's statement about the rig. You know, hey, I've got this coming out, and wow, let me tell you how wonderful it is. And I want to look and see what features they've got in the equivalent of their brochure. Okay, what they say about it. And if I could compile all of those without taking so long, I've got a gray beard to match my gray hair, it might be interesting data to look at. Bearing in mind, we have some features. Does the FT10 have the 3D waterfall?
Yes. And I don't
See,
like
for example, well, see, I was going to ask you. See, part of my background is in an area called data visualization. Government bought me money for my own mainframe when I was a professor, and I had the whole U.S. country, all the counties up on it, and I could rotate them and I could slice them, and I was doing some what they call pioneering work, you know, in doing that. So I've got a background in data viz, as they call it. And when I first saw that 3D waveform, which is what we would call it, I thought, boy, that's pretty, right? I wonder how many hams can actually use it to make decisions operating the rig. And some maybe. I've had two tell me, oh man, I love that. But more like you on the 101 and the 10, I've heard people say, I don't know what the hell I'd use it for. And that maybe operator needs to learn, you know, we all need to learn the radio. It's got its own culture, own character. But yeah, and you've hit an important point. I think the next level of research on this would be to try to get the feature set identified. Because here's the problem. You can't take an SDR paradigm and retrofit features back in time, for instance, because they didn't exist. But yet that is one reason why that spike in performance on the Sherwood measurements occurred, is radios got much better with the adoption of the SDR technology, whether they were SDR radios or not. That happened about the same time. So your point is spot on from my view, and I'm toying with it. If you have any ideas, please reach out to me, because I thought about going back and just compiling whatever the manufacturer said to take the subjectivity out of it. I mean, you're relying on the manufacturer to make their claim, right? And just to say, I don't know, I may go down that road and find it's too rocky and too many sharp pointed nails in it for me to travel it very far. But that's been my thinking thus far. If anybody's got any thoughts on that, would be more than happy to hear what they are. But I think you've hit the nail on the head, as they say.
Thank you.
I'm on mute. Thank you, Bob. Any final questions or comments before we close up? Okay. Well, look, thank you, Frank. That was a great talk. I'm sure the guys have got a lot from that. And certainly, like I say, if they're about to buy a radio or just interested in what they bought or whatever, then I think that's really useful information. And yeah, obviously a huge amount of research that you've taken to get to that point. And it sounds like you're going to continue. So that'll be interesting to see where that goes.
Thank you. And everybody remember, Chris can send you the slides. I can send you PDFs of the NCJ articles if you want them, and feel free to reach out to me for any follow-up. Thank you for having me again. As I said, it's always a privilege and an honor to be asked to share some time, because time is ultimately the most valuable thing that we have. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Frank. And yeah, what I'll do, I'll send out your the PDF of the slides along with the link to the video. So it'll take a few days for me to edit the video and put it onto YouTube, probably early next week. And I'll send out the slides then, so everyone's got a copy of those. So listen, Frank, thank you very much. We'll give you, for those that left, we'll give you a little virtual clap. And
Thank you.
We'll go from there. Thank you.
Thanks, Frank.
Cheers, guys.
Take care.
Thank you very much. Cheers.
Cheers, Frank.
Cheers.